19mm socket, remove the tire. .32mm socket, we're going to remove the axle lock nut. .17mm socket, take the caliper bracket bolt from the knuckle off to break it free. Then I take a caliper bracket, it's a little hook, just pull the caliper right off the rotor. And then I'm just going to hook this right through and hang it up on the strut. Now I'm going to remove the rotor. We can set that aside. So make sure you can push the axle out as much as possible. 14mm socket, I'm going to do it by hand because I don't want to strip it with an air gun. Once I get that socket seated, I'll get my 1/2 inch. Once you break them free, you can switch over to a 3/8 drive. It'll come right out. Do this to all 4. So now we're going to put the socket on the top one, a little extension, slide it through. Once it grabs, break it free. Now you can remove the bolts. .19mm socket, and we're going to remove the top nut for the outer tie rod end. Now with a hammer, you're going to hit the knuckle part that the ball joint goes up in so we can pop it right out. Now you can turn the whole suspension to easily get at those 2 inner bolts for the hub. Now we're going to take the lower ball joint pinch bolt off. That's a 15mm socket. Now that all the bolts are out, I'm just going to hit the actual hub on the outside, back and forth, until it breaks free from the knuckle. Actually, we're going to put the castle nut back on the axle spindle, just to stop that from dropping and hitting the ground. Now with that, take the nut off, pull it right out. So before I pry in the control arm, I'm going to hit with a rubber mallet to see if I can vibrate that lower ball joint a little bit out of that knuckle. Now with that lower ball joint out, we can just pull the axle out of the knuckle. We're going to raise the vehicle up. Now with a pry bar or a axle removal tool, you're just going to pry right here and get that right out of the differential. Supporting the axle with one hand, I just take the pry bar and pull on the other side. And I have a little catch basin underneath to make sure when that differential fluid comes out, it won't make a mess. Guide the new axle in. Once it slides into the differential or front drive axle, now we'll go back out to the wheel well. As you can see, I pre-sprayed the ball joint where it goes into the knuckle and it's the axle shaft, just to help for the future. But you got to put the axle in first into the hub. Line those splines up. And now we're going to pull down on that control arm and line that ball joint back up. I'm going to try to hammer this up with a rubber mallet. Make sure it seats all the way in. A little more. And you'll see the pinch bolt, the half moon right in there. So you can take your actual bolt, make sure it slides in. And I can tell by the angle it has to go up just a hair more. That was a 15mm socket. I'm just going to bottom it out, then I'll torque it to factory specs. 15mm socket, and the pinch bolt to steering knuckle ball joint is 37 foot-pounds. So now we're going to put the outer tie rod in, back into the knuckle. Seat that all the way up, and then take the nut, the blue Teflon on the top. Start that by hand. That's a 19mm socket. We're going to just bottom it out, then torque it to specs. So just bottom that up and then torque it to 20 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to put the new CV axle spindle nut on. I'm not going to torque it till I put it down on the ground. Now we can put the rotor back on. You can use 2 lug nuts to hold that in place if you wish to, or you can just hold it, but I don't like to fight with things. So I'm going to go like that. Because once you put this lug nut on, you can also spin it before you get it all together and see if your backing plate is hitting the rotor. And it is. That's that magical sound. So just pry it back a little. Oh, quiet. There you go. So now we can take our caliper down and line up bracket with the pads. Get the mounting bolts. Make sure you start them by hand. There we go. These are going to be a 17mm socket. I'm going to bottom them out, then I'll torque them to factory specs. So this vehicle has 2 torque specs for the caliper bracket to knuckle bolts. If the bolts are a floating washer, then it's 59 foot-pounds. If the bracket bolt is what they call a flange bolt, like this, it comes with a flange on it, it is 88.5. So it differentiates between the 2 type of bolts. So if you have the one with the floating washer, 59 foot-pounds, the preset part of the nut on the bolt, it is 88.5 foot-pounds. So now we can put it back in the bracket. 17mm socket. We're going to snug it up and torque it. So 88.5 foot-pounds. So the spindle nut is a 32mm socket. I'm going to just snug it. Do not over tighten it because we're going to torque it to 162 foot-pounds. So it's snug. Now before I install the tire, I'm going to take the center cap out. And now I can install the tire and put the socket through there and easily torque that spindle nut. Now I'm going to put the tire on. Put all 5 lug nuts on. Just snug them up. I'm going to lower the vehicle down. 32 millimeter socket and 162 foot-pounds. Now at this point, you can take the wheel back off if you can't get in there. You could torque it without putting the wheel on, but I personally like the new lug nuts and I don't want to strip them with a pry bar going onto the floor and holding that axle from spinning. So sometimes you can get away with this, but you have to pinch that lock bolt in. $19 millimeter, and it is 88.5 is the torque for this. You're going to go in a crisscross pattern. Then double check. Don't forget your center cap.